we talk about player talent, and we name the show The Pitfalls of Projections, and sort of the point that we're trying to get to, that you and I agree on and agreed on before the show and felt like it would be smart to talk through on a show and try to convey, is there are going to be players in situations where, I mean, for you might just not even be looking at projections at all, but I'm going to just throw out projections entirely. Even though I've done the whole projection, part of that is just for me to think through the different ways it could play out, the relative skill level, I think, of the different players, what might happen in different, what guys could break into what types of roles within the offense, or how I think the offense might structure. I think that's a really useful exercise every year. It's a huge part of my research process in the off season. But I mean, we were talking about the Jets a little bit. Breece Hall, he was a guy we didn't get to on the last show when we did risers and fallers, and he's been rising a little bit. And I said to you, he's a guy who basically immediately I know I'm going to just throw out my projection, because in some respect I'm kind of doing that week one snapshot thing where, yeah, Michael Carter's still on this roster. I got to project him for a decent number of carries. I'm actually projecting him for more targets. We kind of think, he has this pass catching background. We kind of think of him as potentially playing a little bit more of a pass catching role alongside Hall, at least as Hall is early in his rookie year. Whether or not that plays out, might not be true. We thought the same thing of Nyheim Hines alongside Jonathan Taylor in his rookie year, and Hines probably did catch more passes that year. I think almost certainly did. But Jonathan Taylor was fantastic. And so there are paths for great players to be great, right? But with Hall in a projection, it's tough, and especially on a team where I'm projecting them to their offense doesn't look great. So I'm looking at things like Vegas win totals and projected points, and I can't really project them for a ton of touchdowns. Worst teams run fewer plays. I'm not projecting them for league average plays per game. I'm projecting them below that. I'm not projecting this team to be particularly good. And so the way that Hall fits in, or even the way that Garrett Wilson fits in, I'm just saying, look, I could be completely missing the point. And if they're good, they're going to elevate the whole team. And this team is probably going to go over their win rate, right? Like it's going to be, or their expected win total. It's going to be like a Bengals thing last year where Jamar Chase has such a profound impact on the entire offense. They wind up going all the way to the Super Bowl. That's not probably going to happen for the Jets, but you have to understand that those are the types of things that can happen, and they're not going to show up in a projection. There's no way that I can get to a Jets projection that accounts for Breece Hall coming in and being a superstar, or Garrett Wilson coming in and being a superstar. So for me, with a guy like Hall, like I said to you before the show, I will not look at his projection. I'm already, wherever he comes out of my running back list is not going to affect my rankings, because it's basically like a floor outcome. You know what I mean? It's okay. They spent a lot of draft capital on him. Here's how he fits in with the other guys they already have on the roster, some of whom are good. Ty Johnson I have for a little bit of work. Tevin Coleman I have for a little bit of work. They have other names there, but there are paths that we know with rookies and young players to just being so good that they tilt the scales in their favor, as you were just kind of talking about, with the talent sort of dictating the way the offense runs. And that would probably change the whole projection for the team. It might change how many touchdowns this whole offense is capable of scoring. If Breece Hall can, I keep bringing up Jonathan Taylor. I don't know that he's going to be Jonathan Taylor. I don't think he's going to be Jonathan Taylor. But if he can rip off some Jonathan Taylor long touchdown runs, that improves the team's season, right? And so it's that's a guy that I'm kind of throwing it out for. And then you look at a guy, I compared him to you, to David Montgomery before the show. David Montgomery's a guy who you feel pretty comfortable projecting for a lot of work. Like I wanted to project Khalil Herbert for more work. I projected Treston Ebner for a little bit of work. But like for the most part, most scenarios, you're looking at the Bears, like David Montgomery's going to get plenty of carries. Yet I'm going to take Breece Hall over David Montgomery every day of the week, but David Montgomery's projection comes out much stronger for me. His targets are higher. I feel more confident that he's going to lead his backfield in targets. And so that's, I don't know, like those two types of players, one where you've seen it and one where you haven't. Even for me, a guy who's always talking about, like, don't trust guaranteed touches, this idea of guaranteed touches, don't pay for past running back production. For a guy like David Montgomery, I don't know that the ceiling is there. We don't know what the ceiling is for Breece Hall. But even for a guy like me, as I do this projection, I have a really hard time not having Montgomery projected for a lot more points. So you understand why drafters then have a hard time when they look at these projections and they start to look at ADP and things, making the types of decisions that we're always kind of sort of advocating for. It's a really interesting process, I think, the way that projections impact ADP and all of that. And I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I had a lot of ideas there as you were talking. And the
Yeah.
first one that I want to kind of look at is this idea of floor and ceiling, properly calibrated expectations, how that affects ADP and how it affects the way people draft. And one of the things that you're famous for, and that we obviously make a focal point of our personal drafts when you and I draft together, and obviously when we draft other people as well. But this idea of the running back dead zone, and it's not necessarily just at the running back position either. I mean, there are going to be areas of the draft that we actually do know are going to be stronger for certain positions than others based on how historically they allow you to win. And so when people are talking about structural drafting, that's one of the things that they're talking about. But I had the range of outcomes tool open here, which you and I had mentioned, and looking at some of these players. One of the things when we're looking at the running backs is that we see some interesting names fairly high. We have Nick Chubb as the running back 8, David Montgomery, whom you just mentioned, at running back 11, and Elijah Mitchell at running back 13. The other thing that we see when we're looking at this is that some of these bigger backs, you think of Chubb and Montgomery there, their floors actually tend to be very solid as well. It's actually some of these smaller guys that I really like and have had a ton of success with, where you actually have sort of the low 25th percentile outcome, which is interesting. But even within that, and I think it's Chubb is somebody who's just, I think, fascinating this year in terms of, again, kind of this red projection where a lot of things could happen. Depends on who the quarterback is. We know at one point that there was a lot of thought that Cleveland would actually go quite a bit more pass heavy if they got great quarterback play. Now we may be at the very opposite end of the spectrum where they're extremely run heavy if they have Jacoby Brissett. But Chubb, the superstar who doesn't is not as involved in the pass game as we would like. Not surprisingly, someone like Derrick Henry, with how many points he scored in the last couple of years, finishes up there as number 2 behind Jonathan Taylor. So we have some run-oriented backs who score fairly well. And we have some good but not great talents in Montgomery and Mitchell who come in kind of in this range. So we know based on projections and based on a tool like this that's using historical matches that it's not a problem of people having poorly calibrated the probable outcomes for these players. The problem comes in terms of how they actually contribute to winning teams. As you're kind of going through the projections, how does that kind of thing pop out to you? And are you thinking through things like the running back dead zone and how these projections are going to fit with what you know about the structural drafting, and kind of thinking through that element of it? Is there any time where you're kind of forcing a guy that you actually know has the profile that could be a league winner up, forcing somebody like you mentioned with Montgomery? I mean, the touches are going to be there, but it's not going to be a league winning situation in the best case. And then there are a lot of situations in which those end up being just very, very low value touches. Even situations where he's actually not separating himself from Herbert that much as a talent, as a player, and they work him in. Does that come into play for you where you're kind of trying to push these guys into a projection that will actually fit what you know you want to do as a drafter?
I mean, this is such a good question because I think the short answer is you kind of can't. I kind of want to know if you have any good ideas for that because, when we were talking about Breece Hall a little bit before the show, the really sharp thing that you pointed out back to me was then you're under projecting the guy behind him and his potential contingent value. Like then I'm projecting Michael Carter for nothing because you need everything to add up on a team level. So either you're projecting the Jets to be a really good offense, run a ton of plays, score a bunch of touchdowns, have a ton of run plays, be very run heavy, meaning they're probably playing in plus scripts, which none of that jives with their Vegas win total of 5.5 games. Or you're projecting Michael Carter to completely take a back seat. This doesn't relate necessarily to what you're saying about the dead zone, but Hall's a guy who I would have liked to artificially project higher because I think that would have reflected a better average of all of his potential outcomes. Because I think there are these outcomes where he is very, very good because we think he is from a prospect perspective. These are the other things that I am going to add to my head when I make up my decision on Hall and why I'm going to kind of just throw out his projection. But to get that into a projection is incredibly hard because it kind of throws a lot of other stuff off, right? Like we talked about Arizona with Marquise Brown. I do think there are these scenarios where Rondell Moore is really good in the first 6 weeks and then is a starter the rest of the year. But to project that outright means you're basically projecting, absolutely nothing from Antoine Wesley, which I'm pretty much projecting anyway, but very, very little from AJ Green. You're projecting DeAndre Hopkins to, in the games that he's playing, maybe not be quite as dominant and kind of have fallen off, which he, was playing through injury last year, but his numbers slipped a little. So we're not real sure. He's still reasonably young, but we're not real sure where he's at necessarily. Maybe you're not projecting Marquise Brown to come and make an immediate splash, and Rondell Moore comes out and ends up being one of the big performers in this offense. To project that impacts everyone else, right? And so but then you go to a team like the Bears again, and you say David Montgomery. This is a team, when you talk about, where's the talent on the offense? There is no talent on this offense, right? So I'm projecting Darnell Mooney for a really strong season. That doesn't mean that Darnell Mooney doesn't have downside scenarios, right? There can be poor play. Hesitate to make this comp, but it's the best one that popped into my head. Calvin Ridley, even before he stepped away last year, wasn't performing particularly well. And maybe that had something to do with the off-field stuff. But Ridley's a guy who was on an offense last year where it looked like there was nothing. And so you felt really confident about his projection. No one's going to take target share from him. But while he was playing, let's just focus on those first games, he wasn't really performing as great because he's still, a player in his own right where, he could have other things going on. I mean, like I said, I hesitate to make that comp because we don't necessarily know if his performance in those first few weeks was related to sort of some of the off-field stuff. But trying to pull that back into the Mooney point, what if Mooney had a bad offseason, comes in out of shape or something? You know what I mean? He's just not there. Him and Fields didn't work out enough together in the offseason. Whatever the reasons are that guys, ultimately have down seasons. What if Mooney has a down season in terms of just Darnell Mooney? That's possible. What that would just mean is the Bears offense would probably stink because there's not a lot of other options there. But when I do their projection, there's no way for me to bake in any of that either. So he's a guy that just based on basically not having anyone else on his team that's worth projecting for a lot of targets, I'm projecting a really high target rate. He's going to look really good in my projections. I do think that's very possible, but I think that's closer to a ceiling. I don't think, because he had a pretty weak supporting cast last year. Last year's version of Allen Robinson didn't do much. He wasn't basically just going through the motions. His targets per hour, and we've talked about this on the show, were well lower than his career low, even his rookie season. He was like a bad player, basically, when he was out there. I mean, that's a fair thing to say, I think, relative to his own production. And besides Robinson, who else was on that offense? There was not much there. And Mooney was good, but not great. So he had that opportunity in this type of offense to be great. I'm projecting him to, again, be good, but not great, basically. But I think there's a real question of whether he has any additional upside above that. So for a guy like that, I almost want to be baking things down. You were asking more about the structural drafting stuff. I mean, that's even a step further than just the individual players. I think about it, but I think it's just almost an impossible thing to bake into projections, which again, I think is a reason to be a little bit wary of the projections themselves, as opposed to some of the player archetype things that we talk about, year two receivers and this and that, and looking at the individual player. And that's one of the big things that you and I focus on in our drafts that I've learned from you. I always say over the years that has helped me a ton is to focus on certain archetypes, to focus on these big picture analyses that we've done, that RotoViz has done, that have, laid the groundwork for these are the types of targets we want. All of these things are tools. I think my main point on projections is they become a tool that's leaned on a little bit too much. You go through a whole process of doing a projections and you're going to trust your projections probably more than you should, especially for certain offenses, which is why I'm color coding them and making them red and yellow. But when you look at, players in the dead zone, running backs in the dead zone, or second year receivers and those types of things, I almost don't want to even pay attention to a team projection, because if that player is something that we don't, let me put it this way. Even when I goose the numbers, and I goose the numbers a little bit for Rondell Moore to try to, I can't goose them enough to factor in what I think is his true potential breakout season, right? I can get him up 5 or 10%, but I think there's scenarios where he's 50% better than what I'm projecting. And if I think that, then I still want to draft him.
Well, let me run this by you. As I'm thinking through that and listening to what you're saying and thinking about some of the ways people are drafting right now, it's kind of interesting because one of the elements originally when the Zero RB article came out was trying to kind of work through with people how a season would unfold and what the scenarios would be and how the first month was actually not the most important. And that as you then move through, that number one, when you're drafting all those receivers, you're going to have that receiver firepower. You win the race to fill the flex, all of that. So it's actually sort of a safe approach as opposed to a risky approach. But then the thing that makes it not just a safe approach, but an approach that has all this upside is that you have the anti-fragile element where chaos ensues, then your team can get a lot better. And the time that you're expecting a team like that to be the best is going to be down the stretch. Now, because of all the tournaments and the huge money best ball tournaments, there's so much focus on that now. And one of the things I was working with people on then was this idea of I've played these teams in tournaments and they've done extremely well, and that is sort of the reason. Now there's so much focus on stacking and correlating and making sure that you're building a team for week 16, for week 17. That's where all the money's at. So if you're going to enter in the first place, that's how you can actually make a lot of money on your entry. But there is the other element. And I'm not saying people are ignoring this at all, but how different would the exercise be? And would it be more or less valuable, or just valuable in a different way, if you set about to do your projections and you're just projecting weeks 15 through 17?
Wow, that's another really good question. Oh man. I think it would be a better exercise. I mean, think about it. That's a really good question because I think we naturally have to try to project week one more. We're projecting towards what's the most likely or whatever. But if the exercise was actually, what do we think is going to happen by the end of the season? And like when we talk about on the show, people love this. They tell us this is a great way of thinking through things. I've heard it many times. Last year we did our 2022 first rounds, right? We'll do it this year. We'll do our 2023 first rounds. Who's going to be the stars as we're talking about drafting for next fantasy football season? That's who we want to draft this year because that means they had a pretty darn good 2022, right? And it's sort of that same concept, right? Who's by the end of this year, what and the chaos that could ensue, what do I think this offense is going to look like? How is the cream going to rise to the top? I would approach that, I think, in probably a lot more effective way for using that as a tool in drafts, because I think I would spend a lot more time thinking through the player talent that we've been talking about. Who can rise and what might that look like? And like when I do a full season projection, I feel like I have to keep in, I just keep going back to the Rondale Moore thing, but I have to keep in some targets for AJ Green. I have almost 50 targets for him because DeAndre Hopkins is going to be out. They brought him back. They're probably going to play him on the outside to start the year. He's going to get at least 6 games there as a starter. And then he's going to, at the worst, mix in a little bit, but potentially continue to play. Who knows, right? But I have him projected for 50 targets. If you're telling me to project week 15 to 17, I wouldn't probably feel obligated to project him for much because I can see a lot of scenarios where by that point with the different players in this offense, it's kind of become clear that he's not really a guy that they need to run a lot of routes. They might still make that mistake because they made that mistake last year, but it would free you up, I think, from a bean counter perspective, from an analytical, I have a finance background, and the way that I look at all these projections, I'm trying to, do it like an accountant and make everything add up. I think it would free you up from that a little bit, where it would turn into a little bit more of an art than science. I think, because you're thinking. It would for me, because I know there's a lot of chaos in NFL seasons, and I don't think I have much ability to project week 15 other than knowing that a lot can happen in that first 14 weeks, and guys can have good games and bad games and things, but cream tends to rise. And so guys like Breece Hall, I probably project Breece Hall for a pretty strong workload, right? And so yeah, it'd be a fun exercise. I'm not going to do it. It takes a really long time to do projections. But that's a really good idea.